Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamarl Thomas, and I'm here with my disembodied co-host, Bob Schlehuber. We have a fantabulous show today, but let's get ready to go against the grain. Right now, you have the soothing sound of my voice, and I'm on a 40th hour of wakefulness. You can't necessarily see it because you can't necessarily see the bags under my eyes. But that said, we are doing the news. We are motivated. We have an extremely good and engaging show. So let's do the news. Right now, in the first hour, we're going to be discussing the bill that has just passed or that will be passing the Senate today for a $2 trillion package in order to rescue the economy. This is expected to vote on and pass later today. Democrats held out for various protections and additional benefits. The bill still has to go through the House of Representatives, but a major hurdle has been exceeded, and this is relief that people are in dire straits and in definite need of support and help from. Clearly, the funds will be helpful and supportive, but the question becomes, is it enough? Is the $2 trillion enough to plug the hole that's going to be effectively erupted in our particular society or our particular economy based on this virus? In the second hour, we have historian and author Gerald Horne for what will be a fascinating conversation on the historical parallels related to the Democratic Party and how that party in 2020 has effectively strangled Sanders. What are the historical parallels? Is the Democratic Party really is the place where movements go to die? We'll get into some political analysis regarding what should the left be doing, for that matter, what should Sanders be doing? Also, what worked in the past? Last but not least, the coronavirus in historical context, and whether or not we're at the precipice of potentially a new paradigm or paradigm shift. And again, the question becomes, what is the historical context to give us a bit of a flashlight in the dark? Today is Wednesday, meaning this is the mystery segment. I was told that I look like a younger man when I'm talking about UFOs, and we have an amazing story that is literally out of this world. Utterly fascinating and shocking. You guys are going to enjoy it, so definitely stay tuned. But first, let's start here. There was consternation last week that Sanders potentially was on his way out. The messaging came out that Bernie Sanders was thinking over his options. For one, obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic, which doesn't necessarily sit all that well in regards to trying to pursue a race. This has sucked all the air out of the room, and it sucked all the air out of the room at the exact moment that Biden had regained his inevitability. As our gifted producer presciently noted, Super Tuesday wasn't that super for Bernie Sanders. Who knew that that would include Super Tuesday, mini Super Tuesday, and mini Super Tuesday? Fortunately, the constellation was alleviated, at least in the short term, with Sanders putting out clear guidance on what his intentions were. The New York Times reported that in responding to a question on the upcoming debates, Sanders' campaign official, Mike Koska, answered that Senator Sanders is running for president. If the debate is held in April, he plans to be there. Meaning, at the very least, Sanders will continue to be in this race up until April. Yesterday, Bob gave a pat on the back saying, hey, keep your chin up, buddy. And hey, right here, note from the blue, Sanders is staying in this thing. Now, personally, of everybody that's been running in the race, be it Trump or be it Biden, I would argue that Sanders has been the one that has been making the most sense. He's the one who, for the most part, been putting on policy ideas. He's been having these meetings where he can have these FDR-esque fireplace meetings. He has been Johnny on the spot with this issue. And despite the Democratic Party, for the most part, almost trying to make him invisible on this topic, he has still been all over the place, and he's been making far more sense than one Joe Biden. We're going to talk about Joe Biden a little bit later, but just so we're clear, this is Sanders talking to Chris Hayes, and listen to how clear, coherent, and focused he is in regards to this crisis. Let's hear the clip.
Is that while Congress, and there are going to be people up all night right now working on this $2 trillion bill, People are working really hard. They understand the extent of the tragedy. We also have to take a deep breath and ask how we got to be in a country where so many people are in financial despair right now. What I worry about is that at a time when half of our people live in paycheck to paycheck, those paychecks are stopping. There are people out there watching this program who are saying, I can't feed my kids tomorrow. How did we get there? How do we have a healthcare system which was so unprepared, among many other things, for this epidemic?
You know, and by the way, that's not just healthcare from the standpoint of individuals. This also amounts to the equipment and supplies that the various companies or the various people in the healthcare sector need. Let's listen to Governor Cuomo discuss his needs and how New York, which is a major epicenter at this point in the United States, is massively ill prepared, and the emptiness from the White House. Let's hear the clip.
I have an immediate problem on the equipment for this wave that is happening. PPEs, gowns, masks, most important are the ventilators. And there has been no response. There has been no response. And that's why I said right here, looking at the camera on your show, to Secretary Azar, he has to be responsible here. Tell me where I get 30,000 ventilators, because, Christopher, people will die.
And that's the catch, right? People will die. He's very clear about this. Depending on the decisions that we make and whether or not we are ill prepared, people will die as a result. Now, the catch becomes, what is the Trump administration doing? Well, the Trump administration has taken the tact that we need to get people back to work as soon as possible, even if that means people may lose their lives. Let's listen to Trump surrogate Larry Kudlow have this conversation, basically making the argument that, look, we have to make some difficult choices on whether or not basically the economy versus life itself. Listen to the clip.
Governor Cuomo said much the same a minute ago. He said, we got to plan the pivot, open the valve. How do you do that?
Well, we're going to have to try to do that. We can't shut in the economy. The economic cost to individuals is just too great. So let's see how this thing plays out. More testing is essential, and we're loading up with tests now. That's going to be a big help. But the president is right. The cure can't be worse than the disease, and we're going to have to make some difficult trade-offs. I'm not the spokesman. I don't want to get ahead of the story. I spoke to the president about this very subject late last evening, so we'll be looking at a number of different things. Let's give it another week.
And you're optimistic you'll get this deal in the Senate today?
And what do you think he means by trade-offs? He's making a distinction between life, limb, and health versus economic output. Yeah, that sounds pretty grim, Jamal. Well, it gets grimmer. If you thought that this was something that they were saying in code, it's not even in code anymore. They're being very explicit that the elderly population may be willing to give up their life so people can make their profits. Let's hear the Lieutenant Governor of Texas make that very basic argument.
And, you know, Tucker, no one reached out to me and said, as a senior citizen, are you willing to take a chance on your survival in exchange for keeping the America that all America loves for your children and grandchildren? And if that's the exchange, I'm all in. And that doesn't make me noble or brave or anything like that. I just think there are lots of grandparents out there in this country, like me, I have 6 grandchildren, that what we all care about and what we love more than anything are those children. And I want to, you know, live smart and see through this, but I don't want the whole country to be sacrificed. And that's what I see. I've talked to hundreds of people, Tucker, and just in the last week, and making calls all the time, and everyone says pretty much the same thing, that we can't lose our whole country. We're having an economic collapse. I'm also a small businessman. I understand it, and I talk with business people all the time, Tucker, and my heart is lifted tonight by what I heard the president say, because we can do more than, you know, one thing at a time. We can do 2 things. So, you know, my message is that let's get back to work. Let's get back to living. Let's be smart about it.
You know, to gaslight and try to act as if it's some level of bravery to put your life on the line for other people's profit and for economic profit is astonishing. But that's the argument that he is making and the Republican Party is making. The Democratic Party, for all its failure of imagination, at the very least, hasn't necessarily taken the tack that everybody needs to immediately get back to work and get the economy going. Of all of these people, though, Sanders is the one that's making more sense. Nevertheless, if you look at the polling, despite what Trump is doing, potentially going to cost millions of lives right now, if you look at polling, Trump is moving up in polling. ABC News poll, ABC News poll, 55% of the public approves of Trump, 43% disapproves. You have another polling, this one is 45%, and that's up 6 for Trump, with another one for 39% Democrats. There is additional poll from NBC News also that's showing Trump over 50%. And again, this is a president that was ill prepared. This is also a president that is going to cause millions of lives to be lost in the policies that he is taking. So why on earth is the Democratic Party losing this particular argument if Trump has been this onerous? And that's why I fall in this line with Sanders needs to stay in the race. Even though they're trying to squash Sanders, you have the situation where Joe Biden is nowhere to be found. Not just nowhere to be found, his responses have been incoherent, his responses have been barely legible, and you have a vacuum, basically, on the Democratic side, trying to make the argument, pushing back on what the Republicans want. That vacuum has allowed Trump and the Republican Party to look as if they were actually doing something. The public has become so deadened to this that they are willing to accept just the look of doing something over actual competence. Bernie Sanders right now has one key play. He needs to grab his support, and he needs to take that support and argue immediately, change it immediately, that we can't do what we've done before. We need to learn our lesson from 2016. Yes, I'd support whatever random Democrat that goes up there. However, I don't believe that Joe Biden can win this without the energy of the youth and without my base. And that base thoroughly depends on policy prescription. So even though I'm Bernie Sanders, and like I say, I would support whoever runs that's blue, no matter who that is, if you really want that support, you're going to have to come up with policy concessions. And Sanders, stick with that argument. They're going to yell, they're going to bellyache, they're going to belly-hoo. But what Sanders' basic argument needs to be is, me yelling at these supporters didn't work in 2016 to get them for the Hillary Clinton. Regardless of what I tell them to do, at the end of the day, they're going to make their own choice, often based on policy. Meaning, if your name is Joe Biden, if you actually want Biden to win over Trump, then you got to give up policy concessions. If Sanders really wants to get something accomplished, if he really wants to get something done, if he really wants to reprioritize his campaign in order to get some real policy concessions, you start there. That's where accountability starts, and that's what accountability looks like. And that's the way Sanders should move forward. He should use his campaign as a nerve truss or a brain center, allowing all of these lefties that he has been able to tap together all across the United States to function as one with this notion of collaboration and perspective in regards to what he wants to accomplish, and combine that with hard-nosed policy. I don't expect Sanders to do that because Sanders hasn't done that the entire race. But imagine what happens the moment that it becomes this notion that you'll get my support when I get policy concessions. And my supporters have every right to expect those policy concessions because that's why they're in this political space. That gets you a different political world, as opposed to the world you have now with little to no accountability. Bob, I think Sanders has to stay in this race. I think he has to stay in this race in order to create some level of competent opposition, even if they try to bury him from the standpoint of Trump and what is taking place in regards to the COVID-19 response. And considering that Trump is winning in this argument on the COVID-19 response, it becomes that much more necessary to have some level of opposition to push back on Trump in this particular crisis. Because if he's able to run the table while being this backwards, what does that say for the Democratic Party in the next election?
Yeah, so much of it just shows you that Donald Trump has his base of people that it doesn't matter what he says, where he says it, whatever it is, it's going to be right. And it comes down to political education. Jamarl, we've talked so much on this show about how the Democratic Party has not been invested in educating the masses. And I've talked to Democratic people before, and they said, well, we don't educate them because if they actually knew what was going on, they'd vote us out of office. And it's quite concerning because that's actually what's happening right now because you don't know what's happening. It's very, very scary right now. If you're reading the headlines, it says $1 trillion, $2 trillion. None of that means anything to anybody. That doesn't mean getting food for your kid the next day. That stuff is incredibly scary because it's just big time DC talk. But how does that actually get to people on the ground? How do they actually have dignity in that process? That's not something American politics is focused on or working on. But we're talking about that here. That's why our show is called Political Misfits. We don't fit into that normal conversation that doesn't center people like you listening to our show. So we greatly thank you for being with us. We'll turn to our first break before we come back with more here on Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. on Radio Sputnik. We're back after this.
Tune in every Monday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for our regular segment, Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers, where we take a look at the state of education across the country. What's happening in our schools, colleges, and universities, and what impact does it have on the world around us? Our resident expert is Bill Ayers, the legendary activist, educator, and author. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Monday and every Monday for Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers.
Welcome back to Political Misfits, the show that goes against the grain. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamarl Thomas, and we're talking about the latest efforts from the U.S. Senate to help address the health and well-being of the nation. And when I say well-being, I mostly mean the well-being of a broken system of capitalistic greed and corporate-run government that puts people over profit, a system that clearly does not center around human dignity, but around consumption and waste, Jamarl. That's what we're talking about. We're trying to fix that. That's what we're trying to fix right now today, in the midst of the COVID-19 international pandemic here, national emergency in the United States. New York, Washington, D.C. are being hit quite hard by the disease as they try to respond. The U.S. Senate there, Jamarl, as we had mentioned at the top of the show, reached a bipartisan deal that would inject $2 trillion in stimulus measures to send direct payments and jobless benefits to individuals, as well as money to state and businesses devastated by the coronavirus pandemic. The Senate agreed to a significant expansion of unemployment benefits that would extend unemployment insurance by 13 weeks and include a 4-month enhancement of benefits, with Democrats saying it will allow workers to maintain full salaries if forced out of work as a result of the pandemic. In the interim, lawmakers also agreed to provide $1,200 in direct payments that would apply equally to workers with incomes up to $75,000 per year before phasing out and ending altogether for those earning more than $99,000. Families would receive an additional $500 per child. The bill also includes $350 billion that would establish lending programs for small businesses, $130 billion for hospitals, and $150 billion for state and local governments. Get your calculators out. It's going to be a long day of math to figure out if that money will get to your pocket and exactly how much relief is coming from Washington, D.C. The U.S. House, in the meanwhile, is on recess still, with members at home nervous to return to Washington, and will most likely favor passing the bill through unanimous consent. Mr. Donald J. Trump previously signed both a $8.3 billion bill in emergency aid and a sweeping package providing paid leave, free testing, and additional aid for families affected by the pandemic into law. If anybody has the in on where those free testing sites are, let us know. We're joined now by Margaret Flowers, Dr. Margaret Flowers, a medical doctor, co-director of Popular Resistance, and a member of the steering committee of HOPE, Health Over Profit, an organization working to achieve a national improved Medicare for all healthcare system. Dr. Flowers, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me back.
You know, the Democratic Party, in my eyes, and watching it here in Washington, D.C., up close and personal, has shifted so far to the right that I don't really see this bill as being some great compromise of two different varying ideologies in this country in a time of national emergency. I see it as a bipartisan conservative bill where Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, along with Mitch McConnell, pretended to argue and debate over a wide-reaching amount of things, but ultimately just injected more money into the capital system that favors the wealthy over the poor. But for me, Dr. Flowers, where's the public option right now for Medicare and healthcare? Where's the Food Delivery Act to seniors? Where's the environmental demands on clean air? Where's anything about relieving sanctions against Iran? I don't see anything in this bill. I understand we're in this historic moment, historic time, but for me, it kind of just seems like a bipartisan neoliberal financial bill that puts Band-Aids on a system that in 6 months from now, if you're past COVID-19, you're still going to have the exact same problems we're facing today. But am I being too cynical? Is this something monumental that should be heralded right now?
No, I think you're exactly right. And, I look at the two parties in Congress, and I really see them as being mostly on the same side with, minor differences. And so the amount, the spectrum of debate in Washington, D.C. is so narrow compared to where most of the country is. And so this is another example of that, a piece of legislation that, is just full of problems and really represents the interests of the elites. I mean, they're calling it a $2 trillion stimulus, but in fact, it's only about $1.6 trillion, and that other $400 billion is basically they're saying, oh, that's a multiplier effect. But Jack Rasmus, a labor economist, points out that that multiplier effect only happens when the economy is functioning. Our economy is not functioning. So this is not even a $2 trillion stimulus. He's calling for more like a $4 trillion. And if we start to break it down, it really is just injecting some money into the system, but it's not changing any of the fundamentals at a time when so many people are saying, look, this system has been failing us for a long time, and we need some real changes. Where's the accountability? Where's the government getting an equity stake in these corporations that it's going to be bailing out? Why, if small and medium-sized businesses are 85% of our jobs, why are they getting so much less than the major corporations are getting? Why are they getting it as a loan instead of a grant? Why aren't we paying off student debt and medical debt? All these things that would have a real meaningful impact on everyday people.
Yeah, Jamarl, we have 40 million Americans already living in poverty. We've needed a stimulus bill like this for a while, and we're seeing the difficulties ultimately for me is why you can't organize and write policy in reactionary times. It's just not a place where people's heads are clear. They're not building the relationships to get into the nitty gritty. They're not actually being able to talk to people on the ground across the country that say, this is exactly what we need. These are people in suits that are mostly fine-ish themselves. I guess they're not fine and hiding from COVID-19. Their husbands, I think Senator Klobuchar's husband tested positive. So they're basically they're not immune by any means, but in many ways, they have wealthy bank accounts that they have savings in. And so by no means are they actually able to talk to American people and see what it is they need. And so they just basically lump money on top of money. But again, these politicians aren't doing the same thing all year round when it comes to healthcare, education, food, and shelter. It's just an interesting time, Jamarl, again, that you see when they have to react in a time of crisis, they're just illy prepared to meet the needs of people on the ground.
Yeah, they're not. I mean, basically, you could look at where they demur to. I mean, they went straight to this notion, we got to protect industry, as opposed to dealing with the actual material needs of the people. Margaret, if Trump goes through with this plan that is effectively going to send people back to work early to protect the economy, can you explain this kind of multiplier effect in regards to the number of people that are going to get ill and why not or abandoning social distancing will be the thing that essentially puts us over the tipping point, regardless regarding the illness? And just at an added extra point for that, whether or not Trump does the social distancing thing or not, the economy is going to take a hit regardless, especially if large numbers of people get ill, correct?
Right. So the Massachusetts Institute of Technology has a really excellent article out where they kind of explain, why we need to flatten the curve out and spread out the number of infections, because this COVID-19 is not going to go away anytime soon. It's here. It's with us. And the only time that we're going to actually have it under control is when, we have a vaccine to prevent it and enough people have gotten it that they've developed immunity to it. So we're looking at a long time, years before that actually happens. And we have a static amount of medical resources right now. We have, a little over 900,000 hospital beds across the country. We have about 70,000 intensive care unit beds. And the whole reason that we're doing this, self-quarantining, isolation, is to prevent, slow down the spread it out over a long time so we don't overwhelm our hospital systems. So if people are going back to work and returning to normal activity in a month, what we're going to see very quickly, especially since a lot of people are infected with the virus and they don't know it. They don't have symptoms. And, in Italy, in one town where they tested everyone, they found that about half to 75% of the people tested positive and didn't show any symptoms. So people are going to be out there spreading this virus. And, compared to viruses like the flu, it is very severe, particularly for people who have health problems or who are elderly. You know, we're seeing really severe cases of this and a high number of deaths. So this is just, it's a classic example of the market is more important than people's lives with this kind of mentality of telling people they can go back to work.
Yeah.
It's not safe to do that.
Yeah, and I don't know if you got the chance, Jamarl. I think you did. We were talking a little bit about Donald Trump, talking about how much he loves Easter and how he wants the country to reopen on Easter. Donald Trump has said he wants to pack churches and that the economy will get going full speed in early April, mid-April, excuse me. In a Fox News interview, the 45th president of the United States said, "I would love to have that. It's such an important day for other reasons, but I'd love to make it an important day for us. I would love to have the country opened up and raring to go by Easter." He went on to say, "Easter is a very special day for me." I don't know if you believe that one or not. Jamarl, wouldn't it be great to have all the churches full? You'll have packed churches all over the country. I think it'll be a beautiful time. And Jamarl, I know Mike Pence is in charge of the White House response to COVID-19, but I promise you all, just like you can't pray gay away, you can't pray viruses away. Dr. Tina Tan,
we could try
it doesn't hurt. If anybody out there is praying, like, obviously go for it. And if it's done in social isolation, I encourage you to pray all day. And it's crazy that basically, Dr. Flowers, you have people coming out, the Infectious Disease Society of America, in response. Dr. Tina Tan said this is of the making of a major public health disaster. I'm not sure where he's getting this information from, but it's extremely flawed. And as much as Trump then later that evening walked back what he had said in a press briefing, saying we'll only do it if it's good, and that they're listening to all the experts in the White House, they'll follow the hard facts and data. And Trump said, "I just think it would be a beautiful timeline." This stuff scares me, Dr. Flowers, because we saw people there the other day in Arizona hearing Donald Trump basically praise chloroquine as the miracle drug. They, not maybe being the most educated people in the world, went and mixed chloroquine phosphate, which is a additive that you add to clean water in a fish tank. And I'm still confused, Jamarl, of how much they actually knew to take. They just did a small scoop, but I don't know how you measure a dosage that eventually kills you as being the accurate dosage to test out to protect you from COVID-19. But they found some amount, and they go on demand to die. I just see that there's going to be churches or parts in the country, Dr. Flowers, that hear Donald Trump saying, "We want you out on Easter, go out on Easter." And you're going to have stories like we've seen in other places in the world where 50, 60 people in a single church are all infected and then just constantly re-spreading and recreating the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what happened in South Korea. It started out of one of their kind of mega churches, and then it spread very quickly. But South Korea actually has a healthcare system and a healthcare infrastructure, and they were able to mobilize the resources quickly and test people, isolate people, locate their contacts. And so they were able to really slow the spread of the virus after that initial spike. We have nothing like that here in the United States. We're not taking the appropriate steps. The people are struggling to get tested, and we should be, testing as many people as possible to get a sense of where this is really, focused, the hotspots in the United States, and then getting our resources there. Teams of public health officials really putting in place a public health plan to reduce the spread, but we're not seeing anything like that. So I think what we're seeing is typical U.S. policy where the money is more important, people's lives don't matter, and it's going to be the most vulnerable parts of the population that are going to be hurt by this. I mean, I just got a call this morning from one of our main organizers in a public housing neighborhood in Baltimore, and food prices have tripled. They're really struggling down there, and there's nothing, that we're seeing in a meaningful way that's going to be helping them out to get through this. A one-time payment is not going to get people through this.
And that's all this is, right? Just the one-time payment that Congress is pushing through. I mean, this doesn't even go forward, up until April or May. I mean, this is something that's going to look. I think the economic consequences of this are going to go forward for months, not just 1 month. Margaret, I'm understanding this correct, right? This is not something that's consistently going to go forward.
Right. That's my understanding of it, is that it's the 300 or 250 billion that goes out to households with checks, the people who are making under 99,000 is a one-time thing. And then the unemployment insurance is only 4 months. But, it's going to take a long time. If you look at China, They had to really shut things down, and they're still just slowly ramping up. 5 million people lost their jobs in China, and they're just slowly and trying to safely get their economy going again. It would be smart for us to do the same thing, to be, we should be forgiving. We should stop all evictions across the country. We should stop all rent and mortgage payments. We should be forgiving debt. We should be subsidizing food. We should be doing the things, covering the medical costs for people. These are the things that would make a tangible difference in getting people through this crisis.
Yeah, and you're seeing the lack of corporations respond. Donald Trump has said we're not going to nationalize like Venezuela, and so companies are basically going to try to find opportunities to make money. While here at a hyper-local level, Mayor Muriel Bowser of Washington, D.C., of the nation's capital, said that they had tried to work with the federal government to set up testing sites and to help produce more medical equipment. And like other states, the federal government said, figure it out yourself. Andrew Cuomo also there on the top of the hour of our show, Jamarl playing a clip there, talking about how they've been kind of left on their own in New York to fend for themselves and find ventilators. Quite scary stuff when your federal, national, and hyper-local governments are out of whack and not communicating. We do have a caller on the line. Diane, thank you for calling in and thank you for your patience. What's on your mind today?
Yes, good morning, Bob and Jamal, and thank you, Phil, for.
Good morning.
Margaret was saying it was $4 trillion. It's not $4 trillion. It's $6 trillion. They're bailing these it's out, and yeah, I'm waiting for my little check. 'Cause every little penny I get, it helps. But here in Richmond, the governor here, he is calling for everybody to be on shutdown for 2 months or over. Liberty College, they have already opened their schools back up, listening to what Trump has to say. But I thank you all guys for being on every day. I thank y'all engineers for making it possible for all of us to hear people talking sensible. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. That's Mrs. Thomas. That's my mama.
I know. Who's Diane, Jamarl? I was like, this is Mama. This is Mama.
Yeah, that's my mama.
Diane. I was like, I think that's Mom.
Giving the feedback on what's going on in Richmond, the eyes on the ground. She's right. I mean, you think about a lot of people who are just barely making ends meet. I mean, my mom gets Social Security. And you think of people who, the overwhelming majority of the people in this country live paycheck to paycheck. And in the context of living paycheck to paycheck, when you push through one payment for something that's going to last for 2, 3, potentially 4 months, I mean, even if you do have a situation where some of the jobs come back, let's be honest, the economic toil over this is going to reverberate out into the months. So I agree with her. And the catch becomes what happens in another month? What happens in 2 months? And does the political instrument conform to actually do something about the misery that's going to be caused?
And Dr. Flowers, I just don't think the structures are there. I mean, you're somebody who's ran for office before, and you had a message that reverberated through poor and working class communities that needed the type of things we're talking about: healthcare, shelter, education, food security, a purpose or a job, something that people can commit to and have dignity working within. You were not in daily communication, I assume, with the vast majority of people that are in office. And so there's this huge disconnect between the politics of Washington, D.C. and those on the ground like yourself that are actually doing the work. How do we start to change those conversations? Is it setting up those communication channels? Do you save the party, or is, to steal the phrase, do you have to kind of burn things down before you can actually rebuild and get the right people in power with access to resources to address the needs of the people?
Well, we have to be aware that, the Congress is hearing from people. They're hearing from their friends. They're hearing from the corporate lobbyists who are, pressuring them. Why are we bailing out the defense industry? An industry that the Pentagon, gets trillions of dollars. And why are we, we have to remember that the banks, basically the Federal Reserve has told the banks and the investors, we're going to buy whatever debt you have that you need us to buy. We're going to make sure that we take care of you. Why aren't we doing the same thing for people? Why aren't we just forgiving all debt? Michael Hudson has put out, a beautiful article calling for a debt jubilee. Those are the things that are going to make a big difference in people's lives. But I think in terms of how do we reach them, I mean, part of it is we have to be talking about what it is that we want. We shouldn't constrain ourselves to what we're being told we can have, but we should be out there talking about what we actually need in order to change our economy. We know it hasn't been working for a long time. We know the fundamentals are extremely flawed. So we need to be talking about how do we actually give power to workers so that they can fight for the things that they need in their lives, the kinds of benefits and income, so that everybody has a living wage? How do we end poverty with a basic income? We should be getting an equity share of these industries that we're bailing out, and then use the income from that to put it into a trust to build a universal basic income so we can completely eradicate poverty. We need to restructure our healthcare system. We need to make education free. We need to restructure our food system, our energy system. There's so much that we have an opportunity right now to do out of this crisis, but we've got to be out there loudly saying what it is. People should be pressuring their members of Congress, writing, whatever platform they have, whether it's your local paper or social media or sending emails out to your friend. We've got to be creating and changing this national dialogue about what it is that we really need in this country.
Margaret, I agree with you on this. Oh, go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry.
No, stay on that. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to make the point that, you're right. All of these issues, these kind of pressing big issues, and the left takes it as almost their philosophical responsibility to kind of focus on these items, despite the fact that mainstream media and, the political space oftentimes ignores this stuff. This is the first election in my lifetime, with maybe the exception of Nader, but not with this level of focal point on issues of class that I've seen. These are big ideas. So what's the difficulty? Why does it necessarily translate then? Meaning, if this took place, say for the moment that the coronavirus took place 2 months beforehand, meaning when they were still voting, let's say in like South Carolina and these other states, do you think the public would have had a different perspective of this race? Meaning the way that Joe Biden has been looking in this race has been utterly abysmal. It has been absolutely embarrassing that the Democratic Party ends up choosing Joe Biden in this race. If this was taking place 2 months ago, and you had South Carolina while we're in the middle of the pandemic like we are now, do you think that the public would have made a different choice?
It's so hard to say because, I found this with my own campaign, is that the corporate media is so good at controlling the messaging, and the whole kind of party machines are really good at targeting their messaging to people. They have so much money that they're spending that, in a real world, in a rational world, it should make a difference. It's the messages that Sanders is giving out there, the leadership that he's showing, and also third-party candidates like the Green Party candidate Howie Hawkins has been putting out excellent statements about that. I think if people were able to have access to that, it could change, the way that they vote, but it's a difficult system. And I think, the reason that Sanders is able to be out there saying these things is because there has been a growing movement in this country, going back to the Occupy movement in 2011, and then on building on that with immigrants' rights, with prisoners' rights, workers' rights, so many ways that people have been mobilizing since then. The growing number of people that have been on strike over the last 2 years, record numbers of people on strike. These types of things are the forces that start to force the corporate media and the politicians to start talking about these things, but they still hold the power. And so ultimately what it's going to come down to, if we want to win, these things that we need, is it's going to also take mobilization and pressure and, civil disobedience of various types to really put an impact on the system. If we were like France, per se, that, was mobilizing regularly and militantly, getting out there and putting pressure on the system, that's when we're going to start to see the real changes that we need. Right now, we're going to get something, but it's not going to be enough by far.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I jokingly talk about when will the 6 foot apart marches on the White House and Congress start, but I'm angry. I know a lot of people are angry, and they have to kind of, as you get to, Jamarl, if people want to be effective, they're going to have to connect across non-traditional media outlets, MSNBC, CNN, Fox. They're not going to be leading the calls for people to take to the streets and to demand that the system actually be held accountable to the needs of the masses. But what does that look like right now in a time of social isolation when people do have the public health imperative? But I hope that there are people mobilizing around the country right now in response. We have a few callers on the line. You're listening to Political Misfits. We're live in Washington, D.C. We're at 202-521-1320. DJ, I think you've been waiting for a second. Thanks for waiting. What's on your mind?
Oh, yeah, I was just, I wanted to make a remark about the illusion of them having that disagreement, like you stated earlier. After both the Democrats and Republican Party, they got done with this argument, which was essentially an argument to see who could build the largest life raft for their donor base. You know, with our tax money and quantitative easing, we have nothing to show for it. We have that $1,200. There's no moratorium on rent or utilities. There's no student or debt forgiveness, which would ultimately allow us to put more money back into the economy. We got nothing. There were some provisions. Nancy Pelosi wanted to add the Obama phone, which I thought was super interesting because you were talking about Israel not too long ago tapping their lines. The Obama lines were monitored. And then they have the Earn It bill. Another thing where they could scan all of your media, the messages online. So it's just a grab at power while easing the people that finance them. And that was the only comment I wanted to share. Thanks for your platform and everything you guys do every day.
DJ, thanks for those really insightful thoughts on a lot of different issues across the board. Yeah, the surveillance piece, one of those issues, again, in times of crisis, continued government surveillance taking place. We saw the story from Israel, basically selling the technology as a way to actually do some good epidemiology work and track the spread of the disease. So on one side, you're saying, yeah, let's use technology. That's what it's here for the betterment of society. But on the other end, we've seen plenty of people, countries, organizations abuse that same power for long time surveillance. We have another caller on the line. Alex, are you here?
Alex?
Hopefully.
Oh. Okay.
We'll try to figure it out there with Alex. So Jamarl, I mean, really important things that DJ said there around technology and usage and who the money is actually going to here in Washington, D.C. This stuff is quite scary. And we'll have, again, we talk about the long-term ramifications of injecting all of this money back into the banks. And I don't know how anybody's ever told again, oh, you can't have college debt forgiveness. Oh, you can't have healthcare for all. Oh, you can't have higher wages for senior citizens and Social Security checks. All of that stuff we now are shown is a complete and utter lie. How does anybody actually listen to that from politicians in the landscape moving forward?
And not just the lie, but also that it was popular. I mean, for the longest time, the Democratic Party ran with this argument that the public doesn't really want these things. These things are unpopular. You can't necessarily run a campaign on these things. And you find out not only are they popular, there's a majority in the country that is on board for it. And I think the most saddest, dispiriting part, and Margaret, you can respond to this. I think we have maybe 2 minutes or a minute. That basically the public, when given a choice, said, we want all of these policy ideas. We prefer all of these policy ideas, expansion of Social Security, taxing Wall Street, Green New Deal, et cetera. We like all of it. And then they would turn around and say, but that can't win, so we're going to vote for Joe Biden. That has to be one of the, it feels like you're playing football and somebody just knocks the wind out of you. It's like you finally get the candidate who makes this argument. You kind of get a candidate that's viable, that the public likes, and then the public still says no, because in their heads, they've become so accustomed to having these kind of deadened expectations that the very fact of somebody pushing something that they enjoy, they agree with, they don't believe it can pass because they're not used to having somebody pushing those ideas. Margaret?
Yeah, I mean, what the Democrats are doing is they're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, basically, the people, if you look at polls on issues that you mentioned, there's supermajority support for them, but the Democrats won't put up that bold vision. People have seen that they say one thing and they do another, and so people just don't turn out. They don't vote because why should they? They're getting just a choice between two awful corporate candidates, and we saw that one thing that Ralph Nader did when he ran in 2000. He inspired a lot of people to come out and vote that hadn't voted before. And so, as long as the Democrats playing this kind of weak side instead of really boldly articulating what it is that people want, they're not going to succeed. And that's why, we really need to build up alternative parties. We need, just like there were abolition parties to challenge the pro-slavery parties, we need anti-corporate parties to be, challenging these corporate parties.
That's Dr. Margaret Flowers, a medical doctor, co-director of Popular Resistance, and a member of the steering committee of Hope Healthcare Over Profit. Dr. Flowers, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Great work.
You're listening to, thank you so much. Jamarl, I hate to do this to Joe Biden, but after this break, we're going to have to bring up Joe Biden. You're listening to Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Fios TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey, everybody. My name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamarl Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning and I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day, I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Milkman Bob Schlehuber. Guys, Bob had a joke on Monday where he went over Joe Biden's appearances on the Sunday morning talk shows. Remember those few seconds of silence where we all laughed because Joe Biden wasn't on those shows. Joe Biden was nowhere to be found. Yesterday, we spoke to CNN, MSNBC, and The View, and boy, things are not looking good. Here it is with MSNBC's Nicole Wallace giving up halfway through a thought, saying, I better not continue. Yes, we're talking about Joe Biden live on these various networks, failing miserably. Let's hear the clip. Joe Biden
We should be making those masks. We should be moving on those ventilators. We can do that. Why doesn't he just act like a president? That's a stupid way to say it.
You know, Donald Trump was asked on...
That's so sad.
Go ahead.
That's so sad. If you watch the clip, you could see that she is absolutely beaming at him like, I don't know the way to look. I don't know the way people look at a toddler, but I would imagine it's kind of the way she was looking at Joe Biden. It's kind of heartbreaking. And there's more. He worries that calling Trump a quote-unquote yo-yo is somehow offensive. I'm telling you, this is going to be painful, but let's also hear this clip.
Now, all of a sudden, he is being tough on China. He's making sure, and now he's being soft on his xenophobia in the past. So I just can't figure the guy. It's like, I don't know, it's like watching a yo-yo. I shouldn't have said it that way. It's like watching.
It feels that way. I want to ask.
He said, I shouldn't have said it that way. This is horrible. I mean, imagine the nervous laughter that is taking place. How much pressure do you think she feels right now? Now that's trip Joe Biden up and say something in order to kind of just put a knife in him. This was massively awkward. This only scratches the surface of these disasters. In fact, here's another one with Sarah Haynes.
No more.
We got one more. Sarah Haynes to express the difference. There's so many of these. That's the problem, right? There's so many of these videos struggling to express the difference between a cure and a problem. Let's hear the clip.
This is Sarah Haynes. In Hot Topics, we talked about Trump saying the government would reassess the recommended period for keeping businesses shut and people at home. Are you at all concerned, as Trump said, that we cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself?
We have to take care of the cure. that will make the problem worse no matter what.
We got to take care of the cure because that'll make the problem worse no matter what. It's so bad. Like, are we pretending that this is not utterly and entirely remarkable, and not remarkable in the good way, but remarkable in the train wreck way? Maybe the Atlantic gets it. It was an article from yesterday entitled, "I Kid You Not, Stay Alive, Joe Biden." Writer Alex Wagner argues this: Democrats need little from the frontrunner beyond a corporeal presence. Think about that. That's where the bar is. Just a corporeal presence. A brain and eyes. That's all you need. I don't even know what to say about this because you're not allowed to say swear words on the air. I mean, my God, talk about lack of political imagination. The writer begins by setting up a hastily arranged Biden event set for the day before South Carolina primary. The press, she writes, was told that Joe Biden will be in full battle mode. He's going to be battle mode. He's going to be unhinged. Here's what we got instead. And yet, when the cameras and the reporters arrived, all they found was a few folding chairs in an otherwise empty parking lot. In front of the community health center, Biden walked out to a podium, mumbled a few words and the improvements that he wanted to make at Obamacare, and then shuffled off alone. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and absolutely nothing in the world had changed. The most notable thing about the event was how unremarkable the event actually was. Here's the thing. This should be remarkable, people. It should be remarked that the Democratic Party has been pushing a candidate for months who can barely, as the author writes, mumble a few words about tinkering on the edges of some half-ass healthcare plan. It should be remarkable that they're pushing a man who excites no one. It should be remarkable that the man is narrowly beating another candidate who spent most of the past year and most of the popular politician in the country. All of that demands some scrutiny. It's bad that the best part that the party can aspire to is a walking corpse that represents the idea of what's in the past, not even really the past, because Joe Biden's history is not good at all. Just staying alive should be more than a limit to our aspirations. Just vote for the avatar of the party that designated Israel team good guy and insist on being recognized as such, even in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. This party wants to resist any introspection, any change by any means necessary, even if that means lashing out against the poor, walking dead Joe Biden to the mass ship full of lobbyists and healthcare executives and everyone else who benefits from the status quo by trying to sail this creaking mass to the White House. This absolutely should be remarkable, and it's exactly these Atlantic reporters or these Atlantic journalists that should be remarking upon it. This is a disgrace. We deserve better. How about you? How do you write that? Instead of just exhorting Joe Biden stay alive, how do you get across that this should be remarkable? The story ends with this. The work that is now to keep the ideas convincing enough for long enough among as many people as possible that the corporeal man can actually win. Bob, you talk about the Democratic Party being feckless and out of touch and not necessarily something that cares about the needs and demands of working people. Is Joe Biden the perfect representation of that? Effectively, a corporeal man. That's all you need, just a corporeal man.
Yeah, I think so. I'm curious though, Jamarl, is this not best case scenario for the Biden team? Isn't Joe Biden out there touching people worse than almost anything he could say? I think you take this.
I mean, like the poking him in the chest and all this other stuff.
He's the UAW worker, the labor union guy, the worker guy, when he said calling him a liar to his face and shushing his aide to then talk. That to me, the confrontational stuff. I don't know if anybody was watching like the news anymore when people are talking. I mean, obviously they are, but in comparison to Joe Biden just getting himself in trouble, those for me, those imageries, the sniffing people's hair, the weird, awkward touching stuff, I feel like that too would have tripped them up. So yeah, not a good look for him across the board. But no, you've seen plenty of Democrats in this country that aren't intellectual. They're not academics that have been studying public policy and budgets and have some visionary outlook. You want people that fall in line. You want people that at the end of the day, they'll Klobuchars, the Kamala Harris, the Beto O'Rourke's, the Pete Buttigieg. These people said so many things bad about Joe Biden, embarrassing Joe Biden, speaking out against Joe Biden. And the first thing they did when they were told to is they got in line. And so, yeah, you don't need people that actually free thinkers. They don't last very long inside the Democratic Party because they start asking too many questions. And once you start asking too many questions, the whole house of cards falls down. And so, yeah, if they have a Joe Biden there and the people around him can then run the country like they're planning to, Simone Sanders, who thinks she's going to be the chief of staff or something, all of your old Obama people just move back in. Those are the people that basically helped tear down Bernie Sanders in 2016, all the Hillary Clinton, say insiders, but just longtime politicos that have been there since the first Clinton administration in the 90s trying to get back into office. And so they don't care if it's Joe Biden, the visionary person talking. These people probably prefer to have a president that's comatose so they can run things and grab power outside of the electoral process.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, ultimately, you have all of these creatures that came back from 2016 and 2020 in order to hold back the night. I would say this, though. It took every last one of them, including Elizabeth Warren, to jump in order to hold Sanders down so they can exceed the primary. So, you know, all things being equal, I would have preferred him to win. All things being equal, I would have preferred him to run in a different way. And definitely put this in context. On Super Tuesday, when Warren stayed in the race and split the vote, you're talking about Massachusetts, you're talking about Maine, you're talking about Texas, you're talking about like 3 or 4 states that the difference would have been allowed Sanders, meaning it would have given this race an entirely different context. So, yeah.
I'm curious. I don't know. You used the word split there. I don't know if there was a straight split. Elizabeth Warren was attracting some different folks than I think had ever gone to Bernie. That kind of nevertheless, she persisted. Crowd a lot of the kind of the resistance moms from the suburbs who weren't necessarily politically engaged. She definitely heard it. Split to me always sounds like 50-50, but she definitely wedged it at a few places. Jamarl, I'm kind of also curious, you could respond to that as well, but I'm also really curious what happens to the credibility of some of these media outlets. And I guess the media is just never accountable to the ridiculous things they say, and they're never actually held to account. But I just seen somebody like Alexi McCannon, a political reporter at Axios, she's their one of their senior writers, and she's on MSNBC, a contributor often, wrote one of the most insane articles that I saw today titled, "Joe Biden is overhauling his campaign and standing up a shadow presidency of sorts amid a national emergency that's eclipsed all other news." What? Nobody's watching Joe. Like, people are watching The View because they watch The View every day, but nobody tuned in to watch The View because Joe Biden's shadow presidency had taken over, and the guy's hardly bringing up coherent sentences. You think he's running a country right now? What are you saying? How are these people so credible? I don't get it.
It's bizarre. I mean, it really is just basically he's breathing. Good enough. I mean, even in the debates, it wasn't anything that Joe Biden had to do that was amazing. Joe Biden just needed to stand there for 2 hours. And the fact that he was even standing up was shocking to many people. I mean, that's the low bar that we're talking about. I don't necessarily think that everybody that was backing Warren was going to go to Sanders. When you were looking at some of the polling, like in Morning Consult and the second choice voting, it was like 40-something% would go to Sanders with a lesser tally going to some of the other candidates. Yeah. So for me, when I was looking at the states, I looked at it and say, okay, if you cut this number in half, you get Sanders one half, and then you split the other half among the other candidates. What's the number, what that looks like? And you get a far more competitive race in multiple states, meaning Super Tuesday could have looked fundamentally different.
Danny, I think Danny's on the call. Danny, if you promise not to swear and give us a 30-second clip, I can get it, Danny, the caller, in really, really quick here, though. Danny, you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Bob. My question is about the provision in the Senate bill that's being voted on today. If I understand it correctly, small businesses less than 500 employees, the government is going to pay their payroll, and if they maintain employment, they will not have to pay that back. It will turn from a loan into a grant. And I think that will make some profound changes on our economy. Obviously, I would have preferred like Rashida Tlaib's plan, but it did strike me like somebody like Jamarl that has a small business, will he be able to, you know, if he is, let's say hypothetically, an LLC, and he lists himself and Aisha as employees, will he be able to?
Yeah, Danny, I hear you, Danny, there. Thank you so much. We do have to get to a quick break. We'll talk more about that and much more on the other side of the break. We'll have all of your answers as these various bills get voted on and parsed through to see who gets that support and who will still be reeling through this You're listening to Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. on Radio Sputnik. We're back after this.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with Bob Schlehuber. Let's continue to go against the grain. Lots to cover over the next hour. We're going to get into some historical context, some of my favorite. I'm somewhat of a history buff, so this is always a thrill for me. We're going to talk about our political climate, our current political climate, but we're going to look at the historical parallels, specifically in regards to Sanders, and if anything came before that gives us some idea on how to move and where to go forward. Later in the hour, we're going to get into some needed historical context regarding how this country accommodated previous pandemics, especially in regards to the most vulnerable in our society. We were speaking earlier today, Bob mentioned the notion of the various services and how those services are under strain. Well, what did we do in the past in regards to, say, something like the Spanish flu, where hundreds of millions of people across the world died? You can reach us at 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320 if you have something that is on your mind. So as I mentioned in the monologue, to cheers and to boos, depending upon whether or not you love him or hate him, Bernie Sanders is staying in the race. He's not going anywhere. And as I made my argument earlier, good. I've argued that this is a good thing. He shouldn't go anywhere. There was reporting last week that Sanders was considering his options as several not so Super Tuesday performances that did not necessarily go all that well for Sanders called his viability as a candidate in question at the exact same time that the coronavirus was hitting, at the exact same time that Joe Biden's electability, for the most part, became once again inevitable. The Sanders campaign official, however, put these rumors to rest, making a comment about the debate, saying, if there is a debate to be held in April, Bernie Sanders will be there on that debate stage, which effectively puts out this notion that Sanders is remaining in the race. To discuss, we're joined by esteemed author and professor Gerald Horne, historian and chair of History of African American Studies at the University of Houston. Professor, how's it going today?
It's all good. How about you?
I'm doing all right. I am so glad you can join us. You were on the show once before, and I still remember the conversation. It was one of the most fascinating conversations I had on the show, so thank you for joining us. So I've argued that Sanders should stay in the race. Now, my main reason for making this point is that basically, if Biden wants to be elected, then Biden needs a contingent of lefties, meaning that Sanders has to kind of get over himself and make this argument that, look, if you want these lefties, you need to give up political concessions because that's the only way I can get these lefties to get your guy over the finish line. Now, my argument is, yes, this is somewhat of a hard response with Sanders. No, I don't believe Sanders is going to do it. But yes, if you're looking for some level of political concessions, it seems like this is where you would start. Is there a historical parallel to this? Meaning, is there something from historical context that gives us this idea on action going forward, and even maybe a clue in regards to what Sanders should do?
Political parallels are oftentimes rather dicey because the situation we face now is not necessarily the situation that was historically. I mean, recall, for example, in 1968, you had a number of people running for president in addition to Richard M. Nixon and Hubert Humphrey at various stages. That is to say, you had Dick Gregory, you had Eldridge Cleaver. There was even talk about the pediatrician, Dr. Benjamin Spock, running on a ticket with Martin Luther King. obviously, we're in a different moment right now, insofar as the progressive forces are not on the march necessarily to the same degree in 2020 as we were in 1968. Having said that, I think that there is some merit to your argument, that is to say that power does not concede anything without a demand. It never has and it never will. And we all know that the right wing and the centrists will be pressing the Democrats from every conceivable angle. So why shouldn't people on the left do the same thing? This seems like common, ordinary sense.
Yeah, I absolutely 1000% agree with you. You know, I'm curious about something else. In the way that we're going with our politics and this notion of concessions and everything else, there's an argument that the Democratic Party is the place where movements go to die. Well, if we're talking about lefties, especially in this election, the Democratic Party almost lined up almost entirely in order to squash that movement. And it didn't just attack the person, meaning the avatar of the movement, it was also attacking the supporters themselves, racist, sexist, bros, I mean, the works. Is the Democratic Party really the place where movements go to die? And this is just another example of it.
I think that's a very intelligent question. Obviously, it's a question we're going to have to debate going forward, starting today. I must say, in the interregnum following the Sanders victory in Nevada and the South Carolina primary, which Mr. Biden won, I think historians of the future, assuming that we survive the pandemic and climate change, will be fascinated by the invective that was hurled, not only at Sanders himself, but at his coalition, as you suggested. I recall a piece by David Brooks in the New York Times, Never Bernie, Never Sanders. You had similar columns written by Bret Stephens in the New York Times. Even Colbert King, the Washington Post, is a black American. He wrote a column questioning Mr. Sanders' position on black people, since Mr. Sanders has expressed disdain for billionaires, and so that means he expresses disdain for Oprah Winfrey and Michael Jordan. I mean, this was really scraping the bottom of the barrel. It was bottom feeding. But I think that kind of hysteria, in a sense, worked insofar as it helped to halt in its tracks what seemed to be a runaway progressive train.
How did FDR do it? I mean, because basically Sanders is trying to recapture that. I mean, you know, we can make arguments about the fireside chats that he should have used more of those. He should have maybe talked about the campaign in the context of American history as opposed to European. So fair enough, there are ways to kind of go at that. But the very basic argument that Sanders was making is basically the argument that FDR was making. Why was it able to gain steam or have legs back then, but not necessarily now? I mean, all of those forces was allied against FDR also, and you can make an argument that media is still powerful or potent back then. But what was the difference? What was the disparity between, I mean, because we had an economic collapse, we have income inequality that is magnificent in regards to any level of comparison within American history. And even in the context of the bailouts, the income inequality with those bailouts, like all of these things were lining up to this thought that maybe the public is realizing something else needs to change that is a little bit more fundamental and structural. Sanders makes the argument, the public agrees with the argument, and then the public turns around and votes Joe Biden. How does that work? How does that work? That's so bizarre to me.
Well, this underlines the point that I was making about the perils of comparing and contrasting different historical epics. That is to say, just as 1968 is different from 2020, the 1930s and the era of FDR is different from 2020 as well. First of all, a number of the New Deal programs, as historians have gone to great lengths to point out, specifically capitulated to Jim Crow Democrats by exempting from its remit and jurisdiction black people in particular, which was a condition precedent in getting a sign-on and a validation from the Dixiecrats. Second of all, you had in the 1930s, a labor organizing drive that culminated with the organizing of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, massive organizing drives, organizing steel and auto and rubber, with the concomitant rising of class consciousness at the same time. You had a U.S. Communist Party that had tens of thousands of members in the 1930s that was organizing. You had a Scottsboro case, which was conducting a global campaign against white supremacy to try to push back against these Democrats. And with all due respect to those of us who are in the trenches today, I don't think you can really make a valid comparison between the movement on the march in the 1930s that helped to propel Franklin Delano Roosevelt into the White House and helped to propel this New Deal program, comparing that with what we're dealing with in 2020.
Yeah, can you explain something to me dealing with Henry Wallace? So this is FDR's vice president. FDR's vice president at some point eventually gets pushed out. The Democrats get Truman in with a little bit of, let's say, political wrangling or underhandedness. Wallace decides to run third party and gets crushed despite being one of the most popular politicians in the country. Now, I know we say that we can't necessarily say parallels, but for a lot of people making the argument that Bernie Sanders should run as a third party, there is still something there with that, right? That makes it that much more difficult for somebody to pull it off, even somebody who's popular, to pull off this kind of new party and pulling all of these people over with him.
Well, you mentioned Henry Wallace, FDR's vice president between 1940 and 1944, who ran on a third-party ticket in 1948, challenging the Democratic incumbent, Harry S. Truman. Recall that at the 1944 Democratic Party convention, Wallace had been pushed out by the party bosses and supplanted and replaced by Harry S. Truman, who apparently had some sort of sign that FDR himself would be exiting the scene, and they wanted their man in place. Despite the fact that Henry Wallace got significant support from people like Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois et al., the fact of the matter is that, and even though I might also say that he helped to push Truman to the left, making Truman move away from some of his pro-Jim Crow positions, which flew in the face of the support that Truman had been getting from the Dixiecrats. If you look at the totals, the Wallace campaign did not do very well. And I think that part of the problem we really have to come to grips with, and I think it's part of the problem that we had in South Carolina, is that many people are asking how and why the black community voted for Joe Biden, which I think is a very legitimate question, particularly given this pandemic, which helps to underscore the necessity not only for strong government, but for items like health care, which Sanders has been pushing and Biden has not. But I think that there is a historical skepticism in the black community with regard to the majority population and its ability or inability to overcome anti-communism, to overcome anti-socialist bias. And I'm afraid to say that there is something to that skepticism, and that is a point we need to confront and somehow deal with.
That's interesting. How do you deflect that then? I mean, because I agree with you, especially on this point, because there is no parallel, at least not that I'm aware of, to Sanders in the way that he has run this race. I mean, this is a country that has had a deep, numero uno country pushing back against the Cold War. And Sanders is running now as a socialist. Now, I had two frames of mind with this. And my thought was, if Sanders is able to win with that argument, basically he has a mandate, because you've effectively ran against every fiber of this country and has still come out the other end with, this basic argument. And then the other thought was, is that too far? I mean, like you say, if there's a deep skepticism in regards to what a particular candidate can get accomplished or whether or not a candidate can get elected going that far, then how do you get people to vote for you if those are the policies that the people want? This is what I mean when I say it's dispiriting. You have a situation where people agree with the policies, would say, yes, this is what we want. And they would still turn around and say, yeah, but we don't think the guy can win, so we're going to vote for the guy who we don't want. How do you get past that? Like, what, is there anything that points in the direction on how to get around that phenomena?
obviously, you're raising the $64 question. Obviously, you're raising a very difficult question. And I'm afraid to say that experience oftentimes is not only the best teacher, it's a harsh teacher. And as I heard part of the segment before me with people commenting upon the rather profound inarticulateness of Mr. Biden and how commenters were suggesting that he was surprised that he could even stand up. Now, for those who might consider that to be ageist, let us also say that I'm afraid to say that there is some validity to those kinds of criticisms. And it may take a harsh bath in electoral politics whereby instead of acting as pundits in a horse race where you're saying, I'm going to vote for Biden because I think he can win, as opposed to I'm going to vote for this candidate because I think universal health care is a must, because I think that public schools should prevail over charter schools, and I think freeways should prevail over private toll roads, that I think the decades of neoliberalism have been a disaster for the working class in particular, and not least, since we're faced with this pandemic, we obviously need a kind of universal health care. Now, it may take the harsh lesson, the harsh experience of this electoral season for many labor unions to begin engaging in the education of their members that would get them to move in a more progressive direction, to get other kinds of civil rights organizations to do the same thing. But as of today, that does not appear to be in the offing.
I want to get in one question, and then I want to bring in Bob to see if he has any questions on this. We continue to be joined by esteemed author and professor Jamarl Thomas, historian and chair of history and African American studies at the University of Houston. We are in the middle of a pandemic, and I think, at this point, you're probably aware of this since, you're in the United States, and we've been, for the most part, slammed with this. When the Spanish flu was going on, what did the United States deal, or how did it deal with the least of our communities? Meaning, like you said, the New Deal, for the most part, was explicitly written in order to keep African Americans out, in order to get it passed. When you have the situation, let's say maybe after the Great Depression, or something to the effect where you have hundreds of millions of people that are dying all throughout the world, how did the United States grapple with that, and how did it deal with the least of us in our society with this issue?
Well, first of all, it comes as no shock or surprise to suggest the United States does not have an exemplary record when it comes to public health and the question of racism. I need only remind you of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment in the 1930s, when the public health authorities in Alabama told these black men that they were treating them for sexually transmitted diseases, but did not, in order to conduct an experiment running the real risk and danger, which eventuated that these men then would become vectors for sexually transmitted diseases over time. That did not reach the light of day in terms of being exposed in the 1950s. It wasn't until the 1990s that U.S. President Clinton apologized. Now, we also know that with regard to experimentation in terms of OBGYN, that is to say women's health, that enslaved women, Dixie, in the 19th century were basically guinea pigs for people like the physician J. Marion Sims, who up until recently there was a statue to him in Manhattan of all. We all are familiar, I'm sure, with the book by the author Harriet Washington, Medical Apartheid, which goes into some detail with regard to the failures and actually the crimes committed against black people and Native American people, and to a degree Puerto Rican people as well, with regard to public health. Now, with regard to the Spanish flu epidemic, surprise, surprise, there was an abysmal failure of the public health authorities in the United States to deal with what you call the least of us. And I think that led to a disproportionate rise in their and the fatalities of these groups. Now, I would hope and imagine that in 2020, we've gone beyond all of that. But somehow I'm not as certain about that as some others might be.
Unfortunately, I'm not either. And you know, one of the other Allens that we need to talk about is it's not Easter Allen. It has to do with I think this was in the Pacific Islands where we were dropping bombs and munitions on, and we tell the people that it's safe to go back, and the people ends up with developing cancer and all of these illnesses associated with it. We knew that those islands were radioactive, and we just used study cases as we watched those people deteriorate. So let me ask you this, and I want to bring in a caller immediately after this, but paradigm changes. Over the course of history, I always make the argument that history, one of the key things is that it does to some degree change, even if it's, takes forever for people to kind of get a new way of doing things. Meaning at some point, the notion of the slave became, we don't tolerate it. At some point, the notion of Roman gladiators, we don't like people. Yes, you can punch the person out, but you can't necessarily murder a person in the ring. What are the things that predate or that preview changes that are bubbling within the context of a society? When Obama gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%, I look at that and think to myself, oh my God, that's onerous. I can't believe people will be okay with that. And yet, the Yellow Vest movement is not necessarily roiling in America. What does it take? And what are the things that typically indicators that show the public or a change in the public consciousness of a society? And is this pandemic the potential for it, depending upon whether or not we end up in a worst case scenario?
Well, I think the pandemic does have that kind of potential. For example, it strikes me that we may be entering a new phase as a direct result of this pandemic. That is to say, recall that President Bill Clinton, in one of his early State of the Union addresses, noted portentously that the, quote, era of big government is over, unquote. This was an obvious capitulation to republicanism, an obvious capitulation to neoliberalism, leading to a tidal wave of privatizations, the rise of charter schools, the evisceration of public schools, et cetera. I think that today, as we are housebound, at least many of us, and are stalked by what it calls an invisible enemy, we recognize that we need strong public institutions. It reminds me, quite frankly, of the experience of so-called sewer socialism in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Recall that Milwaukee had a number of socialist mayors for a good deal of the 20th century, believe it or not. And one of the reasons was that the socialists at that particular time capitalized upon the point that the rich, for the longest, had felt that it was not necessary to put sewers in poor neighborhoods as long as there were sewers in rich neighborhoods, until the public health authorities and the socialists were able to convince them that if you don't have sewers in poor neighborhoods, the disease will spread to rich neighborhoods. Hopefully, we're in an inflection point where some are beginning to realize that if the rich have health care, well, it hardly matters if they are in Manhattan and the poor don't have health care and therefore are more susceptible to COVID-19. It doesn't matter if the prisons and jails are petri dishes for the flourishing of COVID-19, which has been carried out of the prison by prison guards, visitors, etc., nor should we forget that U.S. foreign policy is at odds with itself. That is to say, that putting sanctions on Iran and Venezuela, etc., and yet expecting Iran and Venezuela to suppress COVID-19 in this global village we call planet Earth, where everything is interconnected, whereby you see in Wuhan a suppression of local infections thus far to this date, but the steady rise of infections because people are bringing it in from the outside. I think that those who may not even be deep thinkers might begin to come to the clear realization that the course that we have been on with regard to neoliberalism and anti-communism and racism and all the rest has been at odds with good health, not least.
Baltimore Charles, we have a caller. How's it going? Can you hear me?
Yeah, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So what's the topic for today?
Oh, yeah. First of all, I wanted to say that this is a critique and not a criticism. Dr. Horn is a brilliant historian. And are you from, Dr. Horn, are you down in Texas? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. You down there where they have a resort called the Inn Head, the resort where the governor and all of his political cronies go to party and so forth. And I just say that as a backdrop, and also just to say, we have a case. We have Henrietta Lacks, the black woman down from who was had cancer, cervical cancer, who was experimented on at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and produced what they call the super HELOC gene and so forth, but which went to correct cancer and cure cancer in millions of women all around the world, and to this day is used for experimental and research purposes. But the family has never received a dime. I also I have an addendum to say that the great United States of America put plague or bubonic plague or whatever in the blankets that they gave to the Indians to annihilate them. So I come to the central point that the Bernie bros out there and who support him, they might as well get their course in the background and start singing that the fat lady is about to sing, because Bernie bro, I think, is about done, although his ideas are great. But he's been there for 40 years in the Congress. What is any empirical evidence presented that he has done anything, passed any major legislation, led any movement in the Congress to change the great psychic of America, which Obama says cling to their Bibles and their guns. So here we are. We deal with the psychosis of America, and anybody that doesn't realize that is just not facing reality. So I think what we have to come to terms with is that America is America, and they're stuck in that psychosis. They will be until we come to a resolution of a lot of issues.
Charles, thank you so much for the call, even in non-NFL times. I know you usually likes to give us those updates from Baltimore, but no sports playing right now. Dr. Horn, I've been really curious here the last week of watching mutual aid efforts in my own community. There's people near and around me that I've been fortunate to support as they try to deliver meals to first, basically senior homes that are public housing units in just absolute decaying conditions, $2.2 billion across 8,000 units of public housing stock here needed of repairs to bring things up to proper code. It's just absolute horrific conditions. Meals were dropped off to these seniors yesterday at public housing by community volunteers, and the only people to actually be able to pick up the meals and then deliver them were seniors. And so you're seeing these mutual aid efforts by volunteers and community members in my neighborhood, up to delivering 500 meals to people living in low income or subsidized housing. And here in a few months, when things are quote unquote back to normal, they're going to be told, oh, sorry, we don't have those extra resources to help support your volunteer efforts. We don't have the food anymore. All of these lies that will be told. How do you recommend community groups like that take power in this moment in the crisis to demand that they have the food, they take it over and start delivering it itself? I think it's kind of the Black Panthers and other food programs where they say, you know what, we're going to actually feed people whether we're in a coronavirus crisis or not. We are going to feed the people every single day. That's going to be a community goal of ours. It seems like this moment is ripe for transformation.
Well, I agree, and I think that we need to go over this multi-trillion-dollar bill that is about to come into effect with a fine-tooth comb to see what kinds of funds might be available to help to subsidize those kinds of efforts. In any case, we already know that the poor working class are much more energetic and active with regard to that kind of volunteer activity and helping one's brothers and sisters than the 1%, for example, those who happen to have all the resources. I should also say that since people are housebound, and so am I, let me recommend to you, since we mentioned Baltimore, the segment of the documentary series Dirty Money, which you can find online, which deals with Baltimore and in particular with the real estate properties of the slumlord millionaire, Jared Kushner, a White House advisor and son-in-law to the 45th U.S. president. With regard to the previous caller and concerning Henrietta Lacks, also from Baltimore, recall that Oprah Winfrey did a TV movie about her that you can also find online if you're looking for something to occupy your time. And finally, with regard to smallpox blankets, there's a long history of bioengineering against subject populations, to use that euphemism. I mean, for example, in my book on Southern Africa, I talk about Dr. Death of apartheid South Africa, who collaborated with Dr. Larry Ford of Irvine, California, who developed all manner of pathogens to utilize against liberation fighters in the southern tip of Africa in the 1970s and 1980s. We already know that a stone's throw from where you're sitting in Fort Detrick, Maryland, there is a government facility that's cooking up a witch's brew of toxins for purposes that remain unclear, but that are no doubt nefarious. So I think there's a lot for us to contemplate as we are being stalked by what has been referred to as an invisible enemy.
Good series there. I do like that Dirty Money there on Netflix. Season 1, they also have the episode Drug Short, if you want to get ahead of how the pharmaceuticals are going to try to take advantage of the crisis that we're in right now. That's Dr. Gerald Horn. Dr. Horn, thank you so much for joining us. You're a historian and chair of history and African American studies at the University of Houston. We hope we'll be able to have you back on soon.
Thank you for inviting me.
You got it. We're going to take a quick break. Before we come back, tomorrow, UFOs and much more after the break. You're listening to Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. It is Wednesday. You hear that spooky sound. It is the Mysteries segment. This is one of my favorite segments. Listen, come at me, bro. But this one, I probably get the most invigorated on. This is going for hour 43, 44 wakefulness for me. And yet I am reinvigorated as if I've been to bed for like an hour. So call us with your comments, with your queries, or anything else you want to talk about at 202-521-1320. So between 1952 and 1969, the United States Air Force ran a program to investigate UFOs called Project Blue Book. Now, anybody that knows anything about UFO history, this is one of those big moments in UFO history. In a callback to the program, the History Channel has been running a show by the exact same moniker that is beginning a significant amount of buzz. Now, in the wake of all of the disclosures in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, et cetera, where the military has, for the most part, come out and admitted that they have been seeing UFOs, and B, that they have all these various videos, and C, that they've been doing all of this kind of weird research in physics, and D, is working explicitly and overtly with a company that is only an entire point of existence is to disclose UFO reality. Meaning your government and the military of that government that spends trillions of dollars is now investing and working closely with organizations that study UFOs and deals with the research coming from that instigation of UFOs. This is mind-blowing. This is something that we haven't necessarily dealt with before. So night before last, second season finale, they left with a mind-blowing story. For all of those years where the government acted as if there was nothing to see here, there was nothing beyond our shores, that it's a conspiracy theory, the next time you hear the United States government disavow something or make the argument that it didn't happen, I want you to remember this: Operation Main Brace. Operation Main Brace. Main Brace was a massive international NATO war game exercise in the North Sea in 1962, bringing together 80,000 military personnel, 1,000 military planes, 200 ships from 9 countries around the world. The New York Times reported at the time that this was the largest fleet assembled in this particular area of the world going back to the Second World War. In the activity of this size, with all of these countries and all of these eyes and all of these hands, there was unexpected guests, UFOs, and lots of UFOs. LotScience.com reports that multiple sightings of the unidentified flying objects, UFOs, during Operation Main Brace were documented by pilots and naval officers that appeared on radar, according to the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena, the NECAP, a federal agency that compiled witness accounts of UFO encounters going from the 1950s all the way to the 1980s. Oddly enough, the Pentagon had half-seriously mentioned that the naval intelligence should keep an eye out for UFOs, but no one really expected the UFOs to show up. Captain Edward J. Rupert, a U.S. Navy officer and director of the U.S. Air Force Project Blue Book from 1951 to 1953, said in his account of the Main Brace sightings, nevertheless, once again, the UFOs were up to their old unpredictable selves. They were there. And again, this is the U.S. government saying, nothing to see here, folks. We haven't been paying attention to this. We haven't been investigating this. And going all the way back to the 1940s and 50s, this was clear as day. Not just one nation, multiple nations, all doing military exercise, all experiencing the same thing. Getting to the reporting itself, scores of people, 52 crew members on the Danish destroyer Wilhelmshaven, and I pronounced that poorly, I apologize, saw something unusual. An unidentified triangular-shaped object would move at high speed towards the southeast, according to the NECAP reports. It glowed with a bluish light, and the destroyer commander estimated the speed to be more than 900 miles per hour. More sightings took place over the next week. On September 20th, 1952, 3 officers with the Danish Air Force spotted a shiny disc with metallic appearance flying overhead, vanishing into the clouds. On the exact same day, personnel aboard the American craft USS Franklin D. Roosevelt spied a silvery spherical object that traveled across the sky, NECAP reports show. A reporter named Wallace Linton, who was on the aircraft carrier, described the UFO as resembling a white ping pong ball. He allegedly captured photographs of the object that were reviewed by the U.S. Navy intelligence, but they were not released to the public. My very basic point in going over this story, which should be, again, mind-blowing. These were multiple nations. This took place over 50 or more years ago, and the stories that they were recounting back then are not that drastically dissimilar from what is being reported over the last decade or so. For years, the United States government has said there was nothing to see here. For years, they've argued that there's nothing up there, that basically we don't take a position on this. And you find out they were lying. They were studying this issue. They've been investigating this issue. They've been keeping accounts and documentation on this very specific issue. And we have this kind of pinhole window into what they've been studying, what they've been keeping track of, and to some degree, again, pinhole, what they have been hiding. What we know now, through the hindsight of disclosure over the past few years, what the troops were seeing back in the 50s and experiencing is not that radically different from today. Bob, you're not ensconced in this stuff like talking about. And I heard the story and I thought, wow, that's mind blowing. You have a NATO organization that all of these people were involved in and all of these people were experiencing. And yet the US military and many of these nations will still come up and say, yeah, we don't know anything and we're not keeping track of this issue. Clearly, they are keeping track of this issue. How do you process this? What do you think about this when you hear a story like this?
Well, I just kind of hear it and I let it pass. Which, it's like, it's crazy for you because you're like, how are people not paying attention to this? And for whatever reason, we've been just kind of conditioned into like wanting to ask questions, but maybe not respond to it. I do want to ask Jamarl, though, if this is the same thing that people have been seeing for like 70 years, does that also mean that the people, if it's not us on the UFO side of things, are they not really advancing themselves? Like, are they kind of stuck in doing the same thing, same kind of style ships for the last 70 years?
Well, see, that's the interesting part, right? Because that gets into like technology. Where's the technology being built? Is the technology coming from somewhere else? Is the technology on planet? Is it really us? And we have this kind of bifurcation in regards to the level of technology. It's like all of that stuff is mind blowing. The thing is, though, it's not necessarily the exact same thing. I mean, you may see like these various types of ships that seem to be similar, like the triangles and those type of things that seems to be coming up.
But you're saying like the inside, the stereo system inside the ship, we have no idea.
We have no idea what's in the ships. I mean, the only thing it's like we are literally just seeing it from outside and their analysis based on what's on the outside.
The other question I wanted to ask, and Tyrese, you're on the line, so maybe Jamarl, you can give us a quick answer so we can get to Tyrese before we do talk about the latest from Julian Assange's efforts to be released from jail there in the UK, which is quite terrifying and horrific conditions that he's still under. But Jamarl, the other thing that, I was sitting here in my house yesterday and I'm seeing this tiny little helicopter fly around. And I say to myself, how are some humans, and I know obviously resources and centralized resources are going to help you outdevelop and outpace anybody and everybody else to some degree, but the general populace, the Bill Gates and Steve Schmitz and all these other people were able to do quite a bit of creating technology on their own. I just don't understand how there would be such a dramatic mismatch of physics development between the hidden side of the government and the general populace. And the general populace wouldn't have something more akin to what we're seeing in these UFOs. So that makes me lean to like, it's not us, because wouldn't have other humans outside of the government programs come up with some of these kind of defined physics principles we're seeing these ships follow? That it makes me seem that if it's not human, because the general populace would have more if it was up to human minds to create that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I kind of look at all of these various people who are talking about this stuff, and it doesn't seem like they know what it is. Because to me, the order of magnitude, I think it's almost even weirder if it was us, because that would mean that all of these pilots had no idea. Like the technology was so drastically different in regards to the various elements of our military that people who was, read in on a lot of the stuff, it was so exotic, they didn't even know what it was. Like they thought it was something else. So it's like, I have to believe that you have all of this stuff that was hidden behind the scenes that people are specifically read into, whether it's what, or potentially it's just not us, or potentially it's both. Like, it's so, like, this is what I mean. Yeah, this is what I mean when I say this is a black area. It's hard to know what's true. And in the normal circumstances, politicians lie. What does it mean in the context of this, where not only do you not know what you're observing, not only do you not necessarily know what's in the craft, not only do you even know whether or not it's us, all of the stuff becomes this kind of just open book, with the exception of there seems to be something that these people are seeing, and they seem to be something that they're interacting with. And starting just like from right there, everything else is a jump or guess.
Let's get to Tyrese. Tyrese, I know you wanted to maybe possibly talk a little bit more about the coronavirus. Is the coronavirus, is it us or is it not? I don't know if that works there with that question. Tyrese, how you doing today?
Well, and the UFO question, I think there could be both. I think that in a galaxy, also here that we make it our own. And a coronavirus thing in your pneumonias that's out there. These three politicians yesterday, one was caught saying that the economy over the grandparents out of Texas, that he was dead wrong for saying that need to survive over your own grandparents. He was wrong. The one for Ohio is going after doctors for writing prescriptions, or doctors that's writing prescriptions to people that with COVID-19, going after doctors for writing prescriptions to people to save people's lives. And another governor in Nevada is banning people with COVID-19 from buying hydroxychloroquine, from, life-saving drug, So they got this enthusiasm, nihilism type of view of the world, and they need to be exposed of that, and the drug manufacturers that make these medicines need to ramp up their production. That's all I wanted to say.
Tyrese, thank you, man. I appreciate your call. Also, we have Kevin on the line. Kevin, what's going on?
Well, Kevin's going to talk to us about the latest happenings there in the UK around Julian Assange trying to get bail due to the coronavirus pandemic. Let's take a quick break before we come back with Kevin, Jamarl, and your calls, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlaver here with Jamarl Thomas. As Jamarl alluded to, we are now joined by Kevin Gastala, journalist, documentary filmmaker, writer for Shadowproof.com, and co-host of the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure. Kevin has been following the case of Julian Assange for years now. Today, Assange was denied bail. His lawyers had appealed for him to be released on bail because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which seems fated to steamroll crowded places like prisons. If human decency was part of these proceedings, bail would be a no-brainer, but obviously it's not, Kevin. Kevin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Kevin, I think this was obviously something that every single attorney, lawyer, and person incarcerated in America should be demanding right now, is that they are released from jail for the betterment of the society at large and the public health conditions within prisons. Obviously, we can debate about abolition writ large and maybe which prisoners or people in jail should get out. But for me, if they're basically just going to have a virus spread through these prisons and kill everyone in there, that's clearly not what these people have been punished to. And they should be released immediately before the spread of the disease starts sweeping over prisons writ large. So Julian Assange, somebody that has been tortured through solitary confinement, is being held still there in the UK, attempted to get bail, get out on bail. What happened at that case today? And even the proceedings to me just look like a clown show, to say the least.
Yeah, so the basic fact is that there are lawyers associations and even associations connected with the British government who are involved in management of the prisons that have said because of the pandemic that people are vulnerable, who there's less reason to keep them jailed, less reason to keep them incarcerated, they should be released. We've seen this in the United States. We've seen this all over the world. We've seen countries throughout the world releasing incarcerated prisoners in order to reduce the risk to populations. And so they filed a very simple bail request, put it before the judge. It was an urgent request. He apparently suffers from a chronic lung condition, which we're talking about a virus that hits you severely if you have respiratory conditions. And the fact is that the lawyers are concerned about what could happen to him, and he already had deteriorating health. What will happen if Julian Assange contracts the virus? We know that Belmarsh prison, where he's being held, There's been some lockdown. There have been staff that have been apparently isolating. There's a claim that it hasn't spread among the prisoners, but
Kevin, I mean, that was what was wild to me, is that they basically said at Belmarsh, where Julian Assange is being held, there was some 100 staff that were off sick. And then they were saying at the same time, oh, no coronavirus, nothing going on here. Everybody's fine. And it seemed like the judge just kind of like skipped over that and didn't really kind of settle with the contradiction.
So the question needs to be asked, how do they know that they don't? Are they being tested? Has there been some kind of a review of possible symptoms? But we also know, as we've seen throughout the coverage, whether you're talking about corporate news or even the independent news, everyone's picked up on this, which is that you're asymptomatic for a period of time. You don't show symptoms. So they could come in contact with people who were running the prison. Julian Assange could have. People who are inmates or people who are in the facility could have come in contact. They might be carrying the virus. They might have it. All it takes is people mixing. And I don't know enough about Belmarsh to say that they're actually taking steps to social distance, but we also know that it's near impossible to social distance within these facilities. So that basic fact alone is something that should have been factored into considering his bail, and the judge virtually disregarded it. But I think most importantly is that we're still talking about the personality of Julian Assange. We're talking about someone who, in these circles in which Judge Vanessa Baratzer lives, in which she socializes, that everyone profoundly hates Julian Assange. It's just a fact that people who are elites profoundly hate Julian Assange. And I think you saw that today in her hostility. And we still see that she is insisting in depriving rights to an individual. I mean, this continues a trend that we saw in the prior extradition hearing, where she said that you're going to stay in the glass box at the back of the courtroom and you're not going to be allowed to sit with your attorneys. Well, today his attorneys come before and they ask, can you release him? He's vulnerable to contracting the virus. And she says, no, she believes that he would not show up to future proceedings. She believes he's a flight risk, absent no evidence. I mean, there's been no review conducted to prove that that would be the case. You could actually place him on house arrest and put together arrangements so that he didn't leave. She didn't want to go through that. And the other thing, is, well, yeah, I mean, the bare fact is that she is not willing to go through this and allow Julian Assange to tell her what to do, I believe, is that she wants to make the decisions, and she doesn't like this fact that Assange is asserting himself against her, and that's just the reason why they've come up against this wall.
Yeah, you almost wonder if he should just voluntarily stay there and then maybe to be a contrarian against, let him go. But yeah, not really a fair judicial process. Jamarl, we were having a conversation earlier this morning with our brilliant and great baker, Michelle Whitty, the producer of this show, about how Assange is kind of the everyman, right? If his surveillance and persecution reveals exactly what might happen to all of us, we're all subject to this at any time. And thinking more with his trial to resume in May, we could easily see that case also delayed because of the pandemic. And who knows if he ever gets his day in court to actually be tried, found not guilty, or even have a potential for bail, and then you all of a sudden go a year without court proceedings across the country. And if somebody as high profile of Julian Assange, who has the eyes of so many media around the world, if it can happen to him, shouldn't we all be worried that it could happen to us? And especially in a time with COVID-19 being used to cover to erode our rights in the U.S., it feels scary.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm curious, with Assange in the courtroom this way, has Britain been letting people out of jail based on concerns and fears about the virus spreading?
It's my understanding that Britain is actually behind because the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief who took over after Julian was expelled, or who took over as he had been going through during this pressure campaign within the Ecuador embassy and can no longer run WikiLeaks. His name's Christian Harassman, and Christian has basically pointed to, and I think others within the Don't Extradite Assange campaign have pointed to the United States, actually, because we're seeing state to state that there are facilities that are releasing both detainees and prisoners. We heard the reference example from Christian of the tens of thousands of people who have been let out of Iranian facilities, who are likely to be reincarcerated after the pandemic, but the Iranian authorities are letting them out in order to prevent the further spread. And so my guess is that, like, UK has actually been behind in this and that they are playing catch up, but that's also evident in the way that they've handled the virus. I mean, they just caught up to putting people on lockdown a couple of days ago, a day or two ago. And so I think one thing that's clear is this virus has been allowed to metastasize and spread to such a degree that Assange is probably more vulnerable than he would be in a U.S. prison at this moment, because we're talking about this virus, which we saw spread from Southeast Asia and enter Europe. When I was there in London covering the extradition hearing, it was already creeping through European countries. It was already a concern. But when I left, there wasn't any interest in the UK in putting any lockdowns in place. There really wasn't any sort of like measures taken to limit people's movement. Then the US actually took a bunch of actions, and other countries have taken a bunch of actions in North America, et cetera. And then finally, you've got UK joining, because they had this idea that there was going to be herd immunity, that Boris Johnson got this idea that like everyone was just going to get sick with it, and then the population would become stronger and be able to withstand the virus. And it was a garbage idea, and eventually it was rejected, and now I think the problem is all these facilities.
Unfortunately, they've taken that garbage idea up in the United States, and Donald Trump is saying something similar right now.
Yeah, Kevin, I'm also curious there. You're in the UK. How are people doing now that Prince Charles has tested positive for coronavirus? A day of mourning? What's the mood like there on the ground?
Yeah, I'm not in the UK. I'm actually in Chicago, Illinois.
Oh, you're my home state. Where are you at in Illinois?
Chicago.
Oh, all right. My people in Rockford. A shout out to the Rockford listeners. Yeah, the other person there that was tested positive for coronavirus, Jackson Brown. I don't know if these like are updates that people are interested celebrity wise. I think it catches the wire and the news. Harvey Weinstein, somebody else who in prison was who caught the coronavirus. Jamarl, I still think he was just using that as a ploy to try to gain bail. And that's what I think judges are going to find all of a sudden, where people are either saying, I think I have coronavirus, we do have coronavirus. It is just kind of a bizarre moment where prisoners do have an imperative for the public health and well-being of society to be released at what it would cost to keep them incarcerated. A lot of questions like that, Jamarl, I never really thought we would ever be facing them. And I couldn't think of my imagination to even come up with these questions a few months ago.
Well, we have 25% of the world's population in our prisons, and we only have 5% of the world's population. To give you a kind of idea, like the number of people that are amassed in our jails. You have the majority of those people who haven't necessarily been charged with anything. They're just kind of waiting out in order to get into a trial. Many of them are just poor and broke and can't necessarily afford to use the legal apparatus to defend themselves. And right now, you have this kind of conversation on legalities of this stuff while this is going on. Do you think Assange is going to get a fair trial? I mean, basically, it doesn't seem like he's getting a fair trial. And I'm curious about what's the conversation in the UK around Assange. I know what it is here in the United States. Oftentimes, this is kind of media act as if this is not taking place. But is the UK at the very least having a larger conversation about issues of privacy and what they're going to try to do to Assange if they send him back to the United States? 30 seconds, by the way.
Well, yeah, so just very quickly to answer your question, the one conversation that's happening is that there needs to be equality for the requests, that if the United States makes a request for someone, that the UK needs to equally be able to request somebody. And we've seen this very high-profile case go down in the UK, where Harry Dunn was a 19-year-old who was killed on a motorcycle, and a CIA operative was actually whisked away, escaped the UK. The services actually helped this woman, Anne Sakulis, get out. And the UK doesn't look like they're going to be able to extradite her because the US is protecting. You've seen working class people on the ground in the UK insist that if Julian's going to be extradited, people like Anne need to be extradited back to UK as well.
That is a fair point. Jamarl, that's going to do it for us today. Kevin Gustala, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Big thank you to all of our guests today, including Dr. Gerald Horn, Dr. Margaret Flowers, and our callers. We greatly appreciate you. We hope to hear from you tomorrow. We'll be back at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You'll be listening to Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. on Radio Sputnik. Now get back to organizing.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jackie Lukman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And today on By Any Means Necessary, we're going to be taking a look at the role of the mainstream media here in the U.S. in exacerbating the coronavirus reality. We're going to be talking some about some developments in Colombia and also looking at how the U.S. government and military is operating in Africa in the time of the pandemic. And as always, at 3:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll be taking your calls. But before we can move on, Jackie, tell them what's on your mind.
Well, Sean, Congress and the White House have finally agreed upon a relief package to get citizens through this unprecedented time. And as always, all of the details are not yet public, but what we do know is that citizens will be getting a check in the mail. One check, just one. Under the plan, people making up to $75,000 a year are expected to receive checks for $1,200. Couples making up to $150,000 would receive $2,400 with an additional $500 per child. Now, the new agreement removes the phased-in provision that would have excluded lower-income Americans from receiving the full benefit. They actually didn't want to include lower-income people in receiving the full benefit, y'all. They had to argue over that. The payments would decrease for those making more than $75,000 with an income cap of $99,000 per individual or $198,000 for couples. Now, unemployment insurance payments would be increased and extended to gig economy workers like rideshare drivers, furloughed employees, and freelancers. Now, unemployment doesn't cover those people right now. So the bill would increase the maximum unemployment benefit that a state gives to a person by $600 per week. Now, this is actually a good increase, but the downside is that it's not permanent. It's only for 4 months. Then unemployment insurance goes back to what it was before, unless we're still in this crisis 4 months from now, and this issue has to be revisited by Congress. And I'm sure if it does, they will have just as hard a time coming to a decision as they did this time. So the $500 billion allocation for citizens' relief is divided between a direct payment to individuals and households, and that's $250 billion, and increased unemployment insurance benefits for the next 4 months. That's the other $250 billion of that total $500 billion allocation for people. Now, just a refresher, 140 million Americans are living at or near or below the poverty line. And of course, now with unemployment being as high as it is because of the coronavirus outbreak, it's much, much worse. The gig economy exploded. Millions of Americans needed part-time jobs like driving for Lyft or Uber to make ends meet. And there's nowhere in this country where someone working a minimum wage job can afford a one-bedroom apartment. So yeah, this relief check is welcome for sure, but a one-time payment of $1,200 or $2,400 is not going to help with much more than 1 month of rent or mortgage payment. Now, here's what really would help people in this country with this relief package. If someone would do what Italy has done and suspend all mortgage payments. Now, that was done at the federal level in Italy and announced by the country's deputy economy minister, Laura Catelli. Now, there's some talk among some of this country's largest mortgage providers to suspend mortgage payments for qualified homeowners, but from what it looks like, the only borrowers that would be affected would be those who have mortgages that are guaranteed by Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and that's not every mortgage in the country. And there's no protection forthcoming that I can tell so far for giving renters relief as landlords continue to demand their rent from their tenants. So again, this relief bill is something, and something is better than nothing. But seriously, how much longer are we going to accept that something is better than nothing as the benchmark for what this government can and will do for the people it's supposed to promote the general welfare?